shouldn't the images of the atrocities from Bucha compel a worldwide, unified, coalition kinetic response?
You mean a military war? Tell me more about what you mean.
Sure, a military response led by the United States and the international partners.
As in bringing military troops on the ground from the United States and NATO.
Jen Psaki's tone seems to indicate she thinks this reporter's question is insane, because guess what? It's absolutely insane.
Well, the president has described outrageous things. You've called them atrocities. You've said perhaps we should brace ourselves for worse. Why not?
I think what the president's objective is, and his responsibility, is to make decisions that are in the interest of the United States and the national security of the United States and the American people. And that is not to go to war with Russia. It is to do everything in our power to hold them accountable, to support efforts through international systems to do exactly that, and to provide military assistance, security assistance, and support to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government.
Can I just say, kinetic response is a funny way of wording what the CBS reporter in that video was asking for. That is CBS News radio reporter Stephen Portnoy. And much like other legacy media outlets, legacy media reporters, he is continuing on with this theme of beating the war drums, of calling for, honestly, a serious escalation of the war that's currently taking place in Ukraine following Vladimir Putin's decision to invade that sovereign country. And while it is accurate to completely acknowledge the war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine by Russian troops, it would be a severe escalation of war that would get many other, innocent civilians killed. So again, what Portnoy is asking for there is like, why not? Why not? Why not send our troops? Why not engage in a direct military conflict, meaning direct war with Russia that is led by someone who really presents himself as an irrational actor and happens to also have nuclear weapons? It is incredible how incessant this line of questioning is. We've talked about this before. Portnoy is just another example, a more recent example. But it doesn't just stop there. We also have NBC News reporter Peter Alexander, who also decided to press Jen Psaki about, what's up with the United States not pushing for regime change in Russia? What's up with that? Watch.
Given these awful videos and pictures we're seeing of the atrocities that took place in Bucha right now, is the US policy still one of no regime change in Russia? And if so, why should someone like Vladimir Putin be viewed by the US as someone who should be allowed to stay in power?
Well, I think our policy is no, we are not calling for regime change, and that has not been our policy and continues not to be our policy. But again, Peter, our view is that he is a war criminal and he is somebody who should be looked at by the international system who evaluates war crimes.
I guess the question people say, then why not? He's a war criminal. Why should he be allowed to stay in power?
Well, our policy is not to call for regime change. We're not calling for regime change. But again, he is somebody who's committed atrocities against the people in his country. He's a pariah in the world, and every step we've taken has made that clear to the global community.
Okay, now look, I'm fine with how Jen Psaki answered that question, but let me make it even simpler for him, okay? Calling for regime change is not the job of the United States, even though the United States, of course, has orchestrated coups in the past, certainly in Latin American countries, certainly in places like Iran. However, believe it or not, calling for regime change in Russia, making that official US foreign policy also escalates the war. It escalates the war, again, with a man who is clearly unhinged in certain ways and has absolutely no problem committing war crimes, killing innocent civilians, and he has threatened to use his nuclear weapons on multiple occasions, both directly and through his Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, which we've shown you video of several times. So these reporters really do blow my mind in that, no, they really, their line of questioning just makes it very clear that they think that we need to send troops to Ukraine, that we need to engage in a direct war with Russia, another nuclear power, that we need to escalate it. After covering our failed wars in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, it is incredible, right? But it does remind me of something that Noam Chomsky talks about quite a bit. Because when we talk about manufacturing consent, when we talk about the media just being littered with journalists, reporters, talking heads, pundits, whatever, who clearly want to escalate war, do interventions abroad, is it because they are, meeting in these dimly lit rooms with their cigars and they're being told what to say? No, this is who they are. The fact that these are their values, their beliefs, is precisely what makes them, honestly, attractive hires for legacy news outlets, right? It's conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom in the United States, especially in the media, for a long, long time has been, no, it's like we go in and we save people. That's what we do, right? Even though there's case study after case study after case study of the United States going in and actually just doing nothing more than destabilizing a country or a region in the world. And so there's the US exceptionalism that's kind of baked into the line of questioning. There's the fact that it's actually incredibly dangerous to escalate the war with Vladimir Putin. And then there's just the overall broader implications of having media that without fail, regardless of how much our efforts in various countries have failed, they will always call for escalation, and they're befuddled. I mean, when you pay attention to the way they respond to Jen Psaki's follow-up questions, they're befuddled. It's like, wait a minute, you guys are acknowledging Putin's heinous war crimes. So why wouldn't you want to get more people killed by escalating this war with a direct military conflict with Russia? I mean, they don't phrase it that way. They don't even think about it that way. But essentially, that is what they're asking. And so Biden's unwillingness to do things like implement a no-fly zone or to send troops into Ukraine is actually a smart, measured response because he understands, and I'm shocked to say this, but he seems to understand what's at stake. But these reporters, regardless of how many times Jen Psaki answers the same question, they just don't get it. They don't get it. And of course, I have to mention, I mean, we've committed atrocious war crimes ourselves. Our military has. I'm not saying that that justifies in any way what Russia's doing. And I think it's important to acknowledge what Putin and the Russian troops are doing, the war crimes that they're committing in Ukraine. We shouldn't deny that. We shouldn't gloss over it. We shouldn't minimize it. But I would just like the reporters to take a second, take a beat in thinking about what we've done abroad and whether or not we've, spent any time cleaning house within our own government before we decide to be the arbiters of what can and can't be done, or which leader can or can't lead in a place like Russia. Like, it's not our decision, it's the decision of the people of Russia. Who are we to demand regime change? Okay, don't like Putin, but there are a lot of nefarious figures across the globe who hate the US government, might not like Biden. How would we feel if some random sovereign country decided we want regime change in the United States, we're gonna orchestrate a coup? And I should be careful with that line of questioning because some of you might actually be into it. Not a good thing. We don't want that, right? The US shouldn't want to do the same thing. All right, one final thing I wanted to go back to, a story that we covered earlier this week, because it reminded me, this story that we're talking about right now, it reminded me of this interview that Vladimir Zelensky had on Face the Nation just this past weekend. And I just want you to pay close attention to the framing of the question in this next clip.
Looking and listening to what Vladimir Putin has said, he's called Ukraine not a real country. He said it's controlled by little Nazis. He's called you a drug-addled thug. Is he someone you can negotiate with?
But as a president, I have to do it. Any war has to end, just end.
So Zelensky, I think, answered that question correctly. We have to shorten it down for time purposes, but the framing of the question is what I actually want to have a discussion about, because her framing isn't meant to ask for an optimistic update on the peace negotiations. And that's really the issue that I've had with some of these press briefings. The line of questioning keeps pressuring the Biden administration to escalate the war, which I think would be a major mistake, and I'm very happy they haven't gone in that direction. And I've been wondering, well, does anyone ask any questions about, hey, how are the peace negotiations going? Is there any pressure to essentially get the US government to assist in the peace negotiations in any way they can? And when they do ask questions about the peace negotiations, they tend to sound like what you just saw in that Face the Nation clip. Putin is such a terrible guy. He's done all these awful things, all true. But then the question is, can you really see yourself negotiating with this guy? And the fact of the matter is, Zelensky answered correctly because he really has no choice. You could either persuade the United States and Western allies to escalate the war, which means more innocent civilians die, or you can be willing to do one of the hardest things imaginable as a leader. Sit down and have negotiations with someone you absolutely despise, someone who has done terrible things to you and your people. That's what a real leader is able to do. But Brennan in that clip, more interested in outlining all the terrible things that Putin has done and then really making a statement rather than asking a question when she brings up whether or not these negotiations can happen. The negotiations have to happen. That's really the only answer if you want to save as many lives as possible. That's my take. Some might disagree with it, but I do think it would be a massive escalation of war if the United States got involved with a direct military conflict with Russia.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.